Okay, let's dive in. We're looking today at a really big global shift. It's happening kind of quietly, but it has these huge implications for, well, pretty much everything. We're talking about falling fertility rates.
Yeah, it's easy to miss because it's so gradual, right? It plays out over decades, generations even.
Hmm.
But the numbers, when you actually look at them, they paint this really clear picture. It's a fundamental change in, well, how human society works.
And for this deep dive, we're leaning on a specific set of sources, mainly the book What to Expect When No One's Expecting by Jonathan V. Last. He really digs into this himself.
Exactly. So we'll be using his analysis quite a bit, the data he pulls together, the history.
Mhm.
Basically, our mission today is to help you navigate this material, understand the why behind the drop in births, look at the potential consequences, and see what these sources suggest might be done, if anything.
Yeah, think of us as your guides through all this info. It's complex stuff, definitely. But it's also full of these surprising facts and connections that, really make you think. So let's just jump in. The numbers, what do they actually tell us?
Well, the first thing to really get your head around is that this isn't just happening in, like, one or two places. Fertility decline is.
Yeah.
It's almost everywhere. Globally, the average number of kids a woman is expected to have, the total fertility rate, or TFR, it's just plummeted.
Plummeted. How dramatic are we talking here?
Okay, so back in the 1970s, the global TFR was around 6.0. Think about that. By 1979, it was already down to 4.5, and today, it's sitting at 2.52. We went from an average of 6 kids per woman to just over 2.5 in, like, 50 years.
Wow, that is a steep drop. And the key number you always hear about is that replacement rate.
Right, so for a population to just replace itself, you need a TFR of about 2.1. Globally, we're getting pretty close to that line now. And crucially, most developed nations, they're already way below 2.1.
And the source stresses this is spreading fast now, right? Even in developing countries. Places like the Netherlands, Canada, West Germany, Japan, Poland, Singapore, all seeing sharp drops.
Yeah. And if we zoom in on the U.S., American fertility, well, it's actually been going down for centuries, believe it or not. Back in 1800, the TFR for white Americans was 7.04. For black Americans, it was 7.9 in the 1850s. By 1890, the white rate was already down to 3.87. A big drop even then.
Then came the exception everyone knows, the baby boom. US TFR hit 3.7 in 1960. But the bust after that was incredibly fast. It fell all the way to 1.8 by 1980. That's nearly cut in half in just 20 years.
It's staggering. There was a bit of a rebound, yeah. Peaked at 2.2 around 2007, just hitting that replacement level for a moment. But it's dipped again since. And the source points out something interesting, that rebound was partly driven by higher immigrant fertility. But even there's a trend. Hispanic fertility rates in the U.S., for example, have been falling, moving closer to the national average.
Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting for me, and maybe a bit surprising based on the source material. It's the gap between how many kids Americans say is ideal and how many they actually end up having. I think it was a 2011 Gallup poll. Found Americans thought 2.5 kids was the ideal.
Right. But the reality,
It's quite different.
according to the material we're looking at, that desired number, it acts more like an upper limit. What people actually achieve is often much lower. Over 70% of women finish their childbearing years having had 0, 1, or 2 children.
Over 70% end up with 2 kids or fewer. That number alone, wow. Especially when the ideal is 2.5.
It really shows you the gap between maybe aspiration and reality for a lot of people. And even within the U.S., there's huge variation. The source notes back in 2008, Utah had the highest TFR at 2.6 a year. But Vermont, down at 1.67, that's a 55% difference. Proportionally, that's bigger than the gap between the highest, lowest fertility countries in Europe that same year.
And that difference maps onto geography and politics, too.
Yeah, the data suggests that. Higher fertility tends to be in Western states, particularly those with a strong religious influence. Lower rates are more concentrated in the industrialized Northeast.
Okay, so the numbers are clear. Widespread, dramatic, accelerating downward trend. But how did we get here? And what are the sort of different ways people frame this shift?
Well, to understand that, you really need the history, the cultural context. And it's tough to talk about population without mentioning the long shadow of overpopulation hysteria.
Ah, right. You mean like Paul Ehrlich, the population bomb back in '68.
Exactly. Ehrlich was huge.
Right.
He was on Johnny Carson multiple times. His book sold millions, hugely influential on policy, public opinion in the 70s. He famously predicted, mass starvation, societal collapse in the 70s, 80s because of too many
It
people.
didn't happen. The reality we're talking about now, falling fertility, is pretty much the opposite.
Right. But the source makes the point that even today, even though those predictions were wrong, some viewpoints still focus on the supposed harms of population growth. You see examples cited like an Australian report calling babies an economic drag, or that Oregon State study saying kids are bad for global warming. Some folks even argue lower populations are just better for the planet.
Yikes. That's quite a take.
Yeah. And on a less extreme, but still important note, the sources talk about the rise of the child-free movement. This isn't just people who happen not to have kids. It's a conscious choice, framed as, a deliberate, maybe even superior lifestyle. The book mentions some titles that champion this view.
And there's that quote from the UN Population Fund person.
Yeah, Nikolai Botev. He's quoted saying that in modern society, childlessness emerges as an ideal lifestyle.
Which is just fascinating when you contrast it with history. The source mentions Genghis Khan, right? All his descendants, or European elites centuries ago, for ages, having lots of kids was a sign of status, power, success.
Exactly. And Vegard Skrbek's research, cited in the book, it really digs into this over like 700 years. Back in the 14th century, elites had almost double the kids compared to lower classes. That gap narrowed, and then around 1750, in the West anyway, something weird happened.
Yeah.
The trend flipped. Elites started having fewer children than the lower classes.
And the source calls that a curious maladaptation. What's that mean exactly?
Well, it suggests that somehow, in modern Western society, success, economic, social success got linked to not having kids. And Skrbek found that lower classes tended to copy the fertility choices of the elites. So, as the quote-unquote successful people stopped having big families, others followed suit, maybe unconsciously adapting to a system where kids became more of a hindrance to getting ahead.
That's a really powerful idea about cultural imitation.
Okay.
So we've seen the numbers, touched on the history, the changing attitudes. Let's get to the core question. Why? Why did this happen? What's driving this massive shift?
The sources point to this really powerful mix of economic, social, and cultural forces. Economically, a huge one is that historical shift, right? From rural farm life to cities and factories.
Right, on the farm, kids are extra hands. In the city, they're mouths to feed, consumers, not producers. At least not for a long time.
And crucially, raising them got incredibly expensive. The source really details the staggering costs. The USDA tracked this for decades. Back in 1960, raising a kid to 18, estimated cost was about $25,000. In 2011 dollars, that's about $193,000.
Okay, almost 200 grand. But the source says even that number misses huge expenses.
Oh, absolutely. Things like college tuition, which is just massive. Average in 2010-11, over $7,600 for state schools, over $27,000 for private universities, and that's just tuition per year. And childcare, wow. In 2008, average full-time infant care in a center, almost $14,600 per year.
$14,600 a year just for infant care. Wow, you add college onto that $200,000 estimate, and yeah, it starts to look way too low.
It really does. And get this, according to the source, the global market for just baby stuff diapers, formula, clothes, toys, it's a $1.7 trillion a year market. Puts the economic scale of parenting into perspective, doesn't it?
It sure does. But it's not just the money, is it? There's also this huge time cost involved.
Yes. And this might be one of the most surprising things in the material, actually. Even with more moms working outside the home, the actual time parents spend with their kids has gone up dramatically since the 60s. In 1965, married mothers averaged about 10.6 hours a week with their kids. By 2000, working mothers averaged 12.6 hours. Stay-at-home mothers, 17.2 hours.
Wait, so working moms in 2000 were spending more time actively with their kids than stay-at-home moms did back in 1965?
Exactly. And stay-at-home moms were spending way more time, too. Even dads, married fathers, more than doubled their time, from 2.6 hours in 65 to 6.5 hours in 2000.
That's the real shocker there. Parents are putting in more hours, not less, focused on the kids, even while juggling careers. Kind of flips that whole narrative about modern parents being less involved.
It really does. And then, of course, there's the foregone income, the money you don't earn because a parent, usually the mother, cuts back hours or leaves the workforce altogether. That's another big economic piece.
Okay, so the economics are huge, undeniable. But it's not just money. What about the social side, the cultural shifts?
Massive changes there, too. One of the biggest. Increased education for women. More women pursuing college, grad school careers, often in fields that demand a lot of time and training up front.
Which naturally pushes back the timeline for big life stuff, like getting married, having kids.
Precisely. Average age for a woman's first marriage in the U.S., 20.3 in 1950. By 2010, it was 26.1. Average age for first birth went from 21.4 in 1970 to 24.9 in 2000. And it's higher now.
And we can't ignore student debt, right? That's got to impact young people trying to start out.
The source mentioned the average loan burden quadrupled between the late 80s and early 2010s.
Definitely a factor. The source also really highlights divorce and cohabitation. Divorce rates shot up after 1970. By the early 2000s, the material estimates the lifetime chance of a marriage ending in divorce was around 45%.
And living together without getting married, cohabitation, that just exploded after 1972. Yeah, hugely significant. According to the data presented, by the early 2000s, over 60% of people aged 25-44 had lived with someone without being married at some point. The source estimates that rise in cohabitation alone accounted for maybe 60% of the drop in the marriage rate in the 70s and 80s. Even though the age people first moved in together didn't change much, it just fundamentally altered relationship patterns.
The source also touches on abortion, neutrally describing its role. Legalization after Roe v. Wade in '73, it led to a big jump in reported abortions. Something like a quarter of all pregnancies ended in abortion for the decade after Roe.
That's what the source indicates, yeah.
Right.
Presenting it as something that reduced potential births, it notes it's seen as a modest factor in overall U.S. fertility suppression, though the data suggested a stronger impact among Black Americans.
And the pill, of course. Introduced in 1960, right as fertility started that steep drop, changed the whole equation around sex and consequences.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And beyond specific things like that, there are these broader cultural currents, the growing acceptance of non-traditional families, different lifestyles. For instance, the source notes, increased acceptance of homosexuality might mean some people who might have felt pressured into heterosexual marriage in the past now feel freer not to.
And tied into all that, the source points to something maybe less obvious, the way parenting itself has become more regulated.
Yes. They use car seat laws as this perfect example. I mean, think about it. Mandates, fines if you mess up, complex installation, expiration dates, even that 5-step test for when a kid can finally use a regular seatbelt, which pushes it out to like age 11 or 12 sometimes.
Yeah, just hearing that list makes it sound kind of exhausting.
Right. It adds all these layers of complexity, potential stress, maybe cost, that just weren't there decades ago. Another interesting point the source brings up is housing type. Data consistently shows single-family homes tend to produce more children than apartments or condos. This seems to hold true globally.
Really? Where you live actually correlates with how many kids you have.
Yeah, there was a Canadian study cited that found even after controlling for other stuff, married couples in apartment buildings ended up with significantly fewer kids over their lifetime compared to those in single-family houses. And the comeback of multifamily housing in the U.S. since the 60s, it tracks really closely with that period of steep fertility decline.
Huh. Fascinating. And finally, the decline of religion is mentioned as a factor.
Yes, the source really emphasizes this link. Religious practice, specifically regular church attendance, is strongly correlated with wanting and having more children. Religion can act as a sort of counterbalance to purely individualistic thinking. Surveys show non-religious Americans are much less likely to see 3 or more kids as ideal compared to Protestants, Catholics, and especially those who attend church weekly.
Okay. So, wow. It's this incredibly complex web, isn't it? Powerful economic forces, big social shifts, cultural changes, all pushing fertility down. What does all this mean for the future? What are the potential consequences if these trends keep going?
This is where the sources get into this idea of the second demographic transition. It's seen as more than just fewer babies. Proponents view it as this deeper cultural evolution, prioritizing individual fulfillment, autonomy, over the traditional family, over having kids. Some actually see this as positive, moving towards a more tolerant, individualistic society.
But the end game, if things continue, is population contraction. The source uses Venice as this really vivid example, right? A city basically emptying out because people aren't having kids. It's losing its living culture, becoming more like a museum.
Exactly. That's demographic momentum in reverse. Even if fertility ticked up slightly tomorrow, the current age structure means populations would keep shrinking for a long time. The source throws out a scenario where Europe's population could plummet, maybe from 738 million in 2010 down to 482 million by 2100 if current rates hold. And since fertility is falling almost everywhere, Europe's future might be the world's future eventually.
We're already seeing bits of this, like urban shrinkage in Germany, cities tearing down buildings, closing schools because there just aren't enough people.
Yeah. And economically, the fallout could be huge. The source quotes this stark idea. There's no precedent in human history for economic growth on declining human capital. You fundamentally need people workers, consumers, to drive growth.
And an aging population could also mean less innovation.
The source explores that possibility, yeah. Looking at something called total factor productivity, TFP. Think of it as a proxy for innovation, efficiency. That trend slumped pretty badly after the 1970s fertility drop. And data also suggests entrepreneurship rates are higher in countries with younger populations and concentrated on younger adults.
And then there's the elephant in the room. Fiscal sustainability. Social Security, Medicare, these systems depend on current workers paying for current retirees.
And that worker-to-retiree ratio just tells the story, doesn't it? It was like 160 workers per retiree back in 1940. By 2010, it was down to just 2.9 workers per retiree, projected to hit 2.1 by 2034 as the boomers fully retire and fewer workers are coming up behind them.
That math just doesn't look good on paper.
The source makes one prediction it calls a stone-cold lock based on this. Social Security taxes are going to keep going up. Structurally, in this scenario, they almost have to.
And geopolitically. The source brings up the youth bulge idea, a high percentage of young people, 15 to 30-year-olds. While falling fertility eventually reduces that, the source notes that in places with a current youth bulge, especially if there's no opportunity, that can fuel instability.
Right. Citing places like Iran, Yemen, Syria, countries with lots of young people and associated turmoil. Contrast that with, say, the United Arab Emirates, which is more stable and has a relatively older median age.
Okay, so this quiet demographic shift has these potentially enormous ripples across society, the economy, global politics.
Yeah.
Which leads us to the million-dollar question the source really wrestles with. Can this be changed? Can these trends be reversed?
Well, based on this material, a natural rebound in fertility for industrialized countries, it would be utterly unheard of. And attempts by governments, historically and now, to boost fertility, they've mostly failed.
The source talks about things like bribes and incentives. Russia under Putin tried a bunch of stuff, right?
Yeah.
Medals, cash for second babies, even that family contact day holiday.
Yeah, meant to result in births 9 months later. But Russia's fertility rate is still pretty low, around 1.54. And historical examples, the source cites ancient Sparta, Rome, Mussolini's Italy. They also tried taxes, incentives. Didn't work then either. The argument in the source is basically, you can't effectively bribe people to have kids.
Why not? What's the thinking there?
Because the research presented suggests having kids often makes parents report lower levels of immediate happiness. It's a huge disruption, huge cost. Material goodies just don't seem to make up for that, though the source does note that moral arguments can have some sway.
Japan is another big case study, right? Long-running, severe fertility problems, lots of failed government programs like angel plans.
Yeah, the source argues the core issue there is really a marriage problem, made worse by policies that didn't really help mothers who wanted to work part-time. Decades of effort, and still a big gap between the desired number of kids, around 2.5, and what's actually happening.
France often gets pointed to as maybe a relative success in Europe,
Yeah.
a higher rate, around 1.7, lots of pro-family policies.
True, but the source notes the research is actually pretty mixed on how effective those policies really are. Some studies suggest maybe they just affect the timing of births, not the total number that much. The source kind of pushes back on France being this clear model everyone should copy.
Okay, so if it's so hard and past attempts haven't worked well, what could potentially make a difference, according to the ideas in this material?
Well, first, anything that works would have to be a really long-term, sustained effort, not just quick fixes. And it would need to tackle those fundamental barriers and costs we talked about earlier.
Like the sheer cost of raising kids.
Exactly. The source throws out some ideas about rethinking the whole college system. Like, what if employers could use aptitude tests for jobs instead of just relying on degrees? Maybe like the principle in that Griggs v. Duke power case allows for in some federal hiring. Or create other strong credentialing paths outside universities. Could lower the cost, shorten the time before young people feel financially ready for a family.
What about housing? That came up earlier, too.
Yeah, the source argues high land costs near jobs are a big drag on family formation. They suggest things like improving highway capacity to make cheaper suburban housing more accessible to city jobs. The argument being cars are pretty essential for parents juggling work and childcare. They contrast Dallas and LA, suggesting Dallas's better road network leads to less traffic and higher fertility compared to LA.
Tax code reform is mentioned, too.
Yes, specifically the marriage penalty. The fact that married couples can often pay more tax than two single people with the same income living together, that's a clear disincentive the government could fix.
And the source mentions abortion again in the policy context.
Yes, again, impartially noting that restricting abortion is presented as the only obvious big-ticket policy change a government could make related to birth outcomes. while reiterating it's seen as a modest factor in overall U.S. fertility, stronger among Black Americans. It cites Georgia, where low marriage, high divorce tracked with low fertility before both recovered somewhat without taking a stance on the policy itself.
Immigration also comes up as pretty essential for wealthy, low-fertility countries.
The source argues pretty strongly that substantial immigration is necessary, including for the U.S. BUT. And this is a big but. It stresses the need for traditionalist integration, not multiculturalism where separate cultures exist side by side, pointing to Europe as a cautionary tale about failing to insist on integration into the existing culture. And it also notes the supply of immigrants isn't infinite, as fertility falls in sending countries too, like Mexico.
And finally, there's this idea of cultural reinforcement.
Yeah, basically suggesting a need to protect the role of religion in public life and actively push back against extreme individualism. It uses some powerful quotes here. Teddy Roosevelt back in 1905 calling child-rearing hard but vital work, seeing self-centeredness as the main threat. And
Yeah.
Cardinal Ratzinger in 2004 saying kids are increasingly seen as a threat or burden, not a source of hope.
Okay, so let's just try and wrap our heads around this deep dive. We've looked at the sheer scale and speed of falling fertility globally and in the U.S. We traced some history, different viewpoints from, population bombs to child-free choices.
We dug into that really complex mix of drivers, the economics, the time costs, the social changes, women's education, marriage patterns, cohabitation, even things like housing type and religion.
And we've wrestled with these potentially huge consequences down the road. Population shrinking, cities emptying, risks to the economy, innovation, social safety nets, even global stability.
And we also saw how incredibly hard it seems to be to turn these trends around. Looking at failed policies and considering the few areas the sources suggest might make a difference, tackling costs, system reforms, immigration management, cultural values.
And this isn't just abstract stuff, is it? These trends shape the communities you live in, the economy you'll be part of, the challenges we're all going to face.
Yeah, and it leaves you with this really provocative thought from the sources to chew on. If modern society really has made prioritizing the self, individual fulfillment, the sort of dominant value, and if having children is increasingly seen or experienced as a sacrifice of personal happiness, of resources, what does that fundamentally mean for the future of that society?
Right. Can a society really thrive long term if it starts seeing kids more as a liability than as, a source of hope and continuity? What's the right balance between fulfilling ourselves as individuals and ensuring the next generation comes along? And is that balance something we can even realistically aim for anymore?